Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? Where you gonna run to? All on that day.
Hello and welcome to The Breakdown, brought to you by The Nation magazine and TheNation.com. I'm Chris Hayes, Washington editor of The Nation. Each week here on The Breakdown, we take your questions via Twitter at Chris L. Hayes or via email at thebreakdown@thenation.com. The way it works is this. You send us questions about what's perplexing you this week in Washington, and we try to break it down.
Will I run to the rock? Please hide me, I run to the rock. Please hide me, I run to the rock. Please hide me, Lord, all on that day.
Hello and welcome back to The Breakdown, Week 50, Episode 50 in a collector series. The question this week has to do with our current military intervention in Libya. March 18th, President Obama, referencing UN Security Council authorization, began military operations on Libya to enforce a UN-mandated no-fly zone. There's scattered reports about the level of U.S. involvement, but we've moved ships into the area. It appears that our pilots are enforcing the no-fly zone. We've launched somewhere around 112 cruise missiles. And what's remarkable about all this is that this was announced on a Thursday evening after the resolution, and there was no congressional action whatsoever. Nothing so much as a resolution. There was some consultation. The president sent a letter to Congress basically informing them of the ongoing activities. And there was some pushback from some members of Congress, many in the Progressive Caucus, particularly John Larson in Connecticut, basically saying this is not right. Dennis Kucinich went so far as to say it was completely unconstitutional and floated the notion of impeachment. And this got me to wondering the degree to which the current military actions in Libya are constitutional. Did the president need to go to Congress? That's my question, and to answer it, I have legendary professor at Yale University School of Law, Bruce Ackerman. He's Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science, author of 15 books, broad influence in a whole variety of topics. His most recent work is The Decline and Fall of the American Republic. Professor Ackerman, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, it's a pleasure.
Okay, so let's start out with what the Constitution says about this specific issue about war, who holds the power to declare it, how presidents need to go about going through the process.
Well, the Constitution clearly gives the power to declare war to Congress, but the crucial thing that we should be focusing on is the War Powers Resolution of 1973, because that's where Congress itself tried to define the role of unilateral presidential action of the kind that President Obama has undertaken. And really, that should be the focus, you see, because under the War Powers Resolution, presidential unilateral action is authorized by the Congress itself under very specific conditions.
Okay, so just so that we get some historical context, my understanding of the War Powers Resolution is that the dawn of the Cold War had wrenched a lot of authority into the executive. Truman, if I'm not mistaken, essentially didn't even go to Congress over Korea. And in the fallout of Vietnam, that's when Congress got together to pass the War Powers Resolution, right?
Absolutely right. So this was a very considered decision by Congress and the mass of the American people, really. This is not like a little detail.
Right.
On what we've learned from the Vietnam War and under what conditions we should try to use our growing world power. And the key thing here is that Congress recognized the legitimacy of presidential unilateral action under emergency conditions, which it defines in Section 2C, to be precise. National emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. So if, for example, some group attacks the USS Cole, that triggers under this congressional resolution. And it isn't a resolution. It was passed by Congress. It was over the veto of the president, and it was passed by 2/3 of Congress.
Wow.
It says that if a coal is attacked, then the president can indeed use force for 60 days, during which time he has to get approval from Congress. And if he can't get that approval, he has to leave in 30 more days. So that's what the framework established by Congress after a very broad debate at a constitutional moment, as it were, in which normal Americans were really attending to this.
So the precipitating conditions as enumerated in Section 2C of the War Powers Resolution are, it sounded like there were three of them: an attack on the U.S.,
Right.
An attack on its forces.
Right. Or its territories, yes, that's the third one.
Okay, or its territories. Now, at first blush, this situation does not seem, without a fairly tortured reading of those enumerated conditions, to fit into that.
Completely right. That's why the president has no authority under the War Powers Resolution to have acted unilaterally.
So you think that he is not within the four corners of the law on this?
Absolutely. Now, indeed, one should recognize that some presidents have asserted that the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional. And more interestingly, the Office of Legal Counsel, which is the elite staff of presidential lawyers, have, as it were, through their exercises of interpretation, and I put quotation marks around the word interpretation, latitudinary interpretation, has waged war on the War Powers Resolution. Now, it should also be said, to be fair, that the War Powers Resolution also says that it should not be interpreted to conclude the question. The president can also assert, if he wishes, that he has the power under the Constitution apart from the War Powers Resolution. And many presidents have made such assertions. The key point, of course, is that President Obama was elected to put a check on such unilateral assertions of executive power independent of anything. This was one of the reasons we elected President Obama. And so the tragedy here is that President Obama is embracing the extreme Bush line on inherent executive power to go to war and is confirming the precedents of the last 40 years in which, in one way or another, presidents have tried to get out of the notion that, yes, they can react when the country is attacked or when a statute, for example, authorizes it ahead of time or when Congress declares war, that kind of thing. But they can react in emergencies. The thing in Libya, whatever you want to think about it, and I'm of two minds on the merits, does not represent something like responding to an attack on the battleships.
I want to sort of end up on what the contours of the legal theory being asserted by the Obama administration are, because I think they're unclear. But before we get to that,
yes,
the kind of penultimate question is just, it strikes me there's a number of military interventions that have been undertaken even before the Bush administration, particularly during the Clinton years, that don't seem to me to sit squarely within those same enumerated precipitating conditions in the War Powers Resolution. The NATO campaigns in the former Yugoslavia, the no-fly zone in Iraq come to mind most immediately. How did the Clinton administration negotiate that legal terrain?
You are absolutely correct. The expansion of presidential power and the trivialization of the War Powers Resolution reaches its climax in an opinion written by Walter Dellinger in defense of Clinton's Kosovo campaign, in which he grasps at the fact that there is an authorization and appropriations measure which mentions the bombing to say that Congress has approved of this in the face of Section 8 of the War Powers Resolution, which says that you shall not interpret appropriations measures to do so, except when they really specifically authorize it. So I want to emphasize, you see, Bush, he talked a big game, but he did get congressional approval both for Afghanistan and for Iraq. He talked a big game. But in this particular, Obama is actually putting Bush's theory, he hasn't elaborated the theory yet, there is a claim that there is something in the statutes, I'm interested to find out where it is, that authorizes this action. But Obama is out-Bushing Bush here. He is actually realizing what Bush asserted, and of course Bush asserted in many other contexts. For example, in the torture memo context of John Yoo, that was a different kind of context. So far as getting explicit congressional support was concerned, Bush got it, and Obama didn't, even though he had time to do it. We were spending a lot of time lobbying the Arab League. Here was John McCain and Kerry and a lot of people saying, we're for it, let's go. If the president had wanted to get an authorization, he could have gotten it.
Right.
And he didn't do it. So in that sense, he is confirming this bipartisan project of presidents of both Democratic and Republican persuasion to spring free of the War Powers Resolution and to assert unilateral power. And this is really one of the large themes of my book on the decline and fall of the American Republic. This is a very serious matter. And of course, Obama is setting a precedent for the future presidents of the United States, who will look back and say, look, Obama approved this entire line, ratified this entire line of constitutional development, and we're just continuing this Obama-Bush-Clinton era's elaboration of presidential power.
And the legal theory here, which the president sent a letter to Congress in which he mentions the War Powers Resolution.
That's right.
But does not seem to ground the legal rationale for his actions in the War Powers Resolution, which is to say it is not grounded in some sort of tortured reading of those three sort of precipitating conditions. Rather, it's grounded in a constitutional interpretation of the president's power as a commander-in-chief, which I think John Yoo once famously said that the president is at the zenith of his constitutional power when acting as commander-in-chief.
This letter is ambiguous. You see, the War Powers Act in this Section 2 states the congressional understanding of legitimate unilateral actions of emergency. Then later provisions say that whenever the president puts the soldiers into harm's way, he has to inform Congress that he's done so within 48 hours. The president has complied with that part of the War Powers Resolution, as have previous presidents. They have trivialized Section 2, and when I read the letter of compliance under the War Powers Resolution telling the Speaker of the House and President of the Senate that there's a problem in Libya that we're engaged in here, I didn't see an elaboration of an express constitutional foundation. You see, President Obama has been very careful so far not to explicitly endorse the kind of extreme executive power theories of John Yoo and Dick Cheney and the like. He has been continuing many of Bush's war policies in Iraq and Afghanistan and drones and the like, but under creative interpretations of the statutes passed or the resolutions passed by Congress authorizing the war on terror and things of this kind. He has not bitten the Bush bullet. And so I'm interested to hear what, Secretary of State Clinton says, under the prevailing authorities, this is fine. Well, what are the prevailing authorities? There's a citation, of course, inevitably to Harry Truman's decision that you've already mentioned to go into Korea under a United Nations Security Council resolution, but without the consent of Congress, explicit consent of Congress. But that notice is before the enactment of the War Powers Resolution, which tries to define things after our bitter experience of the Vietnam War. There is a perennial invocation of the fact that since Thomas Jefferson's time, there have been perhaps 200 military incursions of one kind or another, and very few indeed declarations of war and the like. But once again, whatever you want to say, here is this War Powers Resolution in which Americans of the 20th century, the last generation, saw that there's a real problem now that we have a big standing army and things of this kind, tried in a very thoughtful and constitutionally responsible way to structure power. And then the pattern of evasion and that presidents have pursued since then. And the key tragedy here is that President Obama is not trying to put this thing under control, even in a context in which he could easily have gotten this War Powers, the resolution, and would have avoided a lot of the carping and, a stab in the back phenomena that's going to occur. It's a sad day in the constitutional history of the United States, I must say.
Bruce Ackerman is Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale. He's author of 15 books, writes on a wide variety of topics, has been featured in Our Pages. His most recent work is The Decline and Fall of the American Republic. Professor Ackerman, can't thank you enough for coming on The Breakdown.
Well, thank you very much, too.
The Breakdown is a weekly production of The Nation magazine and TheNation.com. New audiocasts are posted each Friday at TheNation.com and available in iTunes. The Breakdown was produced by Ryan Rafferty and yours truly. Senior producers of The Nation are Frank Reynolds and Emily Douglas. Comments and feedback should be sent to The Breakdown at TheNation.com.
Oh, Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? We're gonna run to